Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to debrief a bit about an event that we ran yesterday at the STOA, which is an online community and venue of sorts. And the event we ran was part of a series that we've been doing called the Shadow Play series. And we've been experimenting with different modalities, that's probably not the right word, different ways of exploring the shadow in a playful, curious, open way in Zoom with a bunch of strangers. And so it's been an experiment, but it's been really interesting, really enlightening, and it's surpassed my expectations as far as what you can do on the internet with this kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think the opportunity that we've had so far with this series has shown us all the different ways that this environment online in the Zoomscape can be used and manipulated in a way. It's very malleable. We can kind of shift it and move it around, and it can take different forms. And part of our goal with kind of introducing shadow work to a vast group of individuals who we don't know and who we don't know why they're signing up is ultimately like, how can we test the waters in all these different ways, try something new each week and see how it lands. And Zoom is so interesting because it gives us the ability to keep refining this process and trying different things out, getting feedback, being nimble and flexible, while at the same time kind of being contained in this space of connection, yet at the same time, no one's in the same room together. It's really interesting.
Right. So there's all these things about Zoom that you'd think it would be a downgrade from doing this kind of thing in person.
Yeah.
But in many ways, Zoom can do things you cannot do in person. Everyone's seeing each other face to face in a way. And so you can see people's expressions.
Yeah.
You can kind of have this feeling of communicating with 20 people like directly all at once.
Yeah. Everyone who's like videos on that first page, it's like you're there with them.
Right.
And suddenly like one person's nodding and then everybody's nodding. And it's like, you don't really get that. Even if you're in an in-person event, everyone's sort of like circled up or they're in like classroom style.
Yeah.
That sense of where everyone is at or how they're taking in information, how they're reacting kind of goes past you.
Yeah.
And that's been very interesting on Zoom, just seeing people's faces.
Yeah. And you can send people into breakout rooms, which is the equivalent of maybe you have a group meeting of 30 people and then you snap your fingers and say, okay, we're going to move into groups of 3 to discuss or interact or play this game. And you just press a button and suddenly everyone is sent to these rooms of 3. And the ease at which you could do that it's something that you can take advantage of. It's something that is sort of emergent as, I would say, a way of people engaging in group therapeutic practices, self-work with other people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of possibilities with Zoom, the internet, the way that people can meet up online from across the world. All these things about it are very interesting. And it's not as if the internet's a new phenomenon, but the way that people are meeting up right now because of lockdowns and because of the technology, there's just something new emerging here that we see a lot of possibilities with. And so these events have been an opportunity for us to experiment with this medium of Zoom, you might say.
I mean, also, I think from our perspective, Arran and I have been involved in a lot of community work, in-person events, kind of leading up to the pandemic. And specifically, I was really involved locally in my community, putting on events of a couple of different styles, like circle up, more meditative, interactive therapeutic ones, or workshops and classes. And when the pandemic hit, it was certainly like I didn't want to go on Zoom.
Yeah.
I was just like, I remember the first class I taught online, and I was like, just felt like I was talking into nothingness, even though I could see people's faces if they had their video on. But, you don't have that energy from people. You can't even hear them breathing. It's just like totally silent. And I'm just like lecturing, and
Yeah.
it took some adjustment. But what I particularly really love about what the Stoa has tapped into is allowing these new sort of creative ways to run these events where, as an example, I was not utilizing the chat function when I first started my own personal classes online.
Right.
And now I've realized by going to the Stoa that there is this whole world that people are creating on the chat function in Zoom. And then there's what's happening like on video or what the facilitators are doing. So I've adopted that into my classes. I'm like, drop your questions in the chat, or like, speak amongst yourself, or I'll pull things from there.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, just kind of like the different energies that are happening while you're on a Zoom call.
Right. It's like multitasking.
Yeah.
It's you can kind of triage certain energies with the chat in tandem with having a discussion out loud, and where people can kind of make little remarks, like just like, oh, that's interesting, or like, oh, that reminds me of this book I've read.
Yeah.
Or that's cool, like thumbs up,
Yeah.
+1. There's all these things that can be sort of funneled through the chat that if you were going to funnel them into speaking out loud, you'd have to interrupt the main conversation to do it in some way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting the way that it's almost like there's all these energies that are flowing when you have any interaction with people. And Zoom is somehow allowing those energies to flow more fluidly, more directly in certain ways. And that's, there's also drawbacks of Zoom, of course. And
Yeah, definitely.
You suck away like physical proximity and body language.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that, are irreplaceable. That it's kind of, that can be a downside of Zoom. But, there's also situations where you don't want the feeling of physical proximity, and you don't want the feeling of like body language maybe. And Zoom just, it's just different. It should not be interpreted as a replacement for meeting up in person. It's just a different realm that can be utilized to great effect, we've found.
Yes, I think since we've been experimenting with this series that it's allowed us to get more into that playful space. And maybe that's partly by design with this event, as Arran mentioned, called Shadow Play. It's like, how do we take this deep internal self-work that can be very serious and sometimes really heavy and difficult and painful out into the public with a group of people who are complete strangers to each other, a different group every week possibly. How do we inject this sense of lightness, openness, curiosity to these heavy practices?
Yeah.
So even like the positioning of what we titled the series as like shadow play is
instead of shadow work.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of shadow work. Has been an interesting evolution. And I think each week we've gotten a little bit more playful ourselves. I think like week 1 or even the pre sort of event when we did the raw shadow.
Right. There was sort of a practice run leading up to the 4-part series.
Yeah. It was maybe more of a little bit of an intellectual discussion about what is the shadow and, how do you see it sort of emerging in society or personally or yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But kind of taking that idea of playfulness with the shadow, with that part of our unconscious material, and slowly seeing what's revealing itself to us. And also like, what are people responding to? And are they enjoying that we're getting a little bit more playful ourselves? Do they want to get a little bit weird even with us? And I think that's a lot of what we want to talk about today was like the most recent event that we did, a little bit more experimental, and how people received it.
Yeah, so the format of the Stoa is that there's events listed on a website. These events vary quite a bit. There's all kinds of weird things happening at the Stoa. But there's an event posted called Shadow Play, and you can click to register for the event, and then you show up, and you don't know what you're going to get. It's just a bunch of people can Zoom in from any place in the world, anyone who has an internet connection. Zoom is free, so it's really kind of a roll of the dice of what's going to happen as far as who shows up. But people who come to the store are generally pretty intellectual, pretty self-aware, and have already accumulated some sort of arsenal of self-work practices. That's pretty common. And people show up to the event. The event's an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, and they're there to see what you have to offer them and play around with any ideas you throw at them. People don't really know what to expect at most of these events, and because we're switching it up every week, that's also kind of like what's going to happen this time. So it really is an interesting interaction between us, the facilitators, and I don't even know what you would call them. It's kind of like an audience, but it's also kind of a attendees. Yeah. So they're gonna show up and they're gonna interact and they're going to follow our instructions. And this week we wanted to play around, experiment. I mean, I had no idea if this was gonna work. I was feeling kind of nervous about it, and I woke up the morning with like feelings of doubt of like, this is not gonna land, or this is not gonna vibe with people. They're not gonna get it. And it's going to be maybe a kind of throwaway event, but oh well, we'll see what happens. But the idea was to try to personify or anthropomorphize the shadow, and then to play around with whatever comes out.
Yeah, it's tapping into, first and foremost, like the layer of the psyche that relates to archetypal frameworks, to the mythopoetic frameworks, to narrative, to fiction, because we can project this unconscious material very easily into characters. We do it all the time, even consciously. I relate to this type of character all the time, or every time I play an RPG, I'm this class.
Totally.
So there's this natural propensity that we have, that psyche really has, in wanting to develop a story, to find the kind of inherent pattern within, and that can be something that we consciously recognize and identify with, like the hero or the warrior. But at the same time, those other parts of our unconscious also have their own patterns and their own ways that they're forming. If you kind of go back to the episode about complexes, what we're getting into is that each of these sort of building blocks of our psychology have an archetypal core. Right. So what is that anchoring point? And that transcends just the archetypal image of, say, the mother, but at the same time, we can relate to this image of like the great mother to Demeter or something like that. Because at the core of our relationship to our own mother, the personal mother, the transcendent mother, is some pattern, some inherent sort of cosmic pattern of mothering that is just inherent to us as humans. And that's what we're starting to tap into with this event.
Right. So playing around with the narrative or mythological framework, it unlocks something within you that you're not really in touch with consciously. You can definitely become more consciously in touch with it by doing these kinds of exercises, I would say. But there's something that it's subverting what I would say is the sort of intellectual, normal conversational realm. And it's going into something that is more instinctual, and it just kind of comes up in you. Who knows why you might identify with a certain character in a large cast from a TV show like Game of Thrones, for instance. There might be a character in the show that you resonate with the most. Why is that? What's happening there? Is it just a rational analysis of the character, saying, well, like, clearly he has blonde hair and I am also blonde, so that's who I identify with? It's like, no, there's something else going on. What is the archetype that Jon Snow is plugging into as the sort of outcast who becomes the leader, who must journey into the darkness and bring light into a world that's turning cold and make great sacrifices, sacrifices that, he sacrifices the women that he loves, and all these things about the character. It might resonate with you, and you can play around with that and try to identify why that is. And that might be true for all kinds of different mediums. You might see that in Lord of the Rings. You might identify with a character in Game of Thrones. You might identify with a character in Lord of the Rings. You might identify with a character in Harry Potter, in Star Wars, in a video game, anything like that.
Yeah.
There might be a character that you choose if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, and you might say like, well, I'm going to be a warrior. I like the warrior class. And someone else might be really intrigued by a mage or sorceress class and what's happening there.
Yeah. Well, we're tapping into all of the parts of our personality, and this is at like the basis of, you know, the Jungian complex theory, that we are made up of all these different parts, and you see sort of like more modern manifestations of that in like the IFS, the internal family systems model, which is like psyche is divided into these little personalities, these parts, you might say. And that's not to say like we're totally divided and prone to like mental health issues, but that, you know, I think most people, if they really start to reflect on themselves, they recognize that, well, there's this part of me that feels this way, and there's another part of me that feels like that. It's like we naturally use that kind of language. And it helps us to externalize that different sort of psychological material and to understand it as a part of us, yet at the same time outside of maybe like the main form of consciousness that we have. And especially when we work with the shadow, this type of parts work is really profound and really powerful because it helps us to navigate our inner world, not being sort of tied down or limited to maybe the wounding of that part, you know, or the tendency, the bad behavior that that part has. It's a way to recognize it, acknowledge it, to call it ourself, yet at the same time to say, I can understand this part better. What are its needs? What is it trying to protect me from? What was its origin story? And when that happens, it creates this bridge, this dialogue to that part, and it will lead to, at least I believe, a better chance of integration and understanding.
Right. So yesterday at the event, people showed up and we presented them with these prompts, and the prompts are aimed at turning your shadow, turning the contents of your shadow, and hopefully everyone showing up kind of understands the shadow as a concept. And even if they didn't really get it, it still works. Even if you're just like, "What's your dark side?" You know, people can still kind of like play with that.
Yeah.
But it seemed like most people got the idea of the shadow pretty well. But to turn your shadow into some sort of character or being or entity or creature, whatever it calls to you, some kind of character that you would find in a myth or story. And what does that character look like? What does that character do? What are their motivations? How did they get to be the way they are? What's their origin story? And what's their name? And, you know, to me, I wasn't sure if that would work. And maybe even to the people listening right now, like that might sound like a sort of strange idea. Maybe not. Probably if you are listening to this podcast, you don't think it's very strange. But the things that come out of that were really interesting. I thought someone, for instance, came up with the idea of their shadow being a blob, and the blob just criticizes everything around it, and sort of almost like it spits acid everywhere onto things, where it's like something's wrong with that and something's wrong with that, and that's not good enough, and you're not doing it right, and I don't understand why you would do things this way. And it's, you know, it's one thing to recognize that you have a shadow that is like highly critical of everything, but it's another thing to say it's like some sort of ooze or some sort of jelly. You know, you have to look at that and wonder why. Where does that come from?
Just the image alone, you know, where does this mental image of this like totally non-human like substance, because maybe this part of you feels not very human, you know, it isn't like a critical mother kind of, you know, archetype or something like that. It's moved into a place where it's like this is something from like a bad 80s like B movie or something.
Right, like from a horror movie.
Yeah.
I mean, like The Blob, literally,
Yeah,
that movie.
The Blob.
I've never actually seen that. I'm not even sure
I
what
haven't
that
either,
movie
but
is
I'm just like imagining like it like oozing and it's gross and people don't want to get near it. And then there's like a group of young teenagers who are just like spending the movie like running away from it. And that's what it did, right? For her, she was just like constructing this story of what it does and how it pushes people away. And it's twisting situations towards this overly critical nature, the tone of that comes forward, and that drives people away, or it doesn't even get into like the intention of why people bring up these ideas in the first place. It just cuts them down.
Yeah.
And what happens then is that this is why I think parts work can be so powerful, is because naturally when we move into these elements of our shadow and we start acting from this place of, you know, criticism or wounding or whatever it might be, it can then be really easy to become self-critical or feel guilty or to put ourselves down, like I did it again, like I did that bad habit again or whatever. And you just you internalize a lot of that shadow material even deeper without truly understanding why it's doing what it's doing. So instead, the next time it happens and you find yourself being critical, you can say, oh man, that was the blob. Like the blob came out. And why?
No, the blob is here.
Exactly. The blob's here. So it's time to maybe dialogue with the blob.
Yeah.
Why did you say what you did? Okay, stop. It's really gross.
But it's interesting because, you know, like she says, like the blob is green.
Yeah.
Like even something like that, it's like the color is like, is that just because the stereotypical ooze from movies is green?
Yeah.
Sort of, or is there something about the color green that resonates with your shadow for some reason? There's all kinds of interesting questions like that of like, where's that coming from?
Right. This is where you can treat the development of the part like dream work in interpreting it like a symbol, which is like, it's this color or it has this feeling tone to it. And what's my association to that? And where does that come from in me? Or what is like the cultural dynamic that's coming in?
Yeah.
You get to pull apart this unconscious material in the conscious waking world and bring greater awareness to it. And all of those little details, especially when you give it an origin story, you figure out what it looks like. Does it have any items on it? All of these things, you then get to kind of write out or figure out more of why that image has come up in the first place.
Right. And, you know, she probably feels as though the shadow in some sense is gross.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something you don't want to touch. Something that is like get away from me. Like,
or gives her a feeling of inner disgust.
Yeah. Exactly. Or something like caustic or acidic or something. Something that sort of consumes everything around it. There's all kinds of ways that you might relate to your shadow, where the way that you repress it is out of disgust.
Right. Yes.
And that's very different from another person's interpretation of the question, where like this other individual put forward the idea that their shadow felt like Strider from Lord of the Rings. And that's completely different interpretation. It's like there's all kinds of things. Maybe the whole perception of what the shadow is could be different. Maybe the question is being interpreted different by each person. That's certainly true. But the idea that the shadow might be some strong warrior that's meant to be king, you know.
But I liked his character that he put forward, because as Strider, some of the points that he was bringing up was that he's hidden. He holds himself back. There's a lot of self-denial of his power, of his future, of who he's meant to be. You know, like Strider is not Aragorn, you know, King of Gondor.
Right.
He's in a place where he's still like keeping himself withdrawn from society. And that self-denial is a very potent shadow energy in a lot of people. And at the same time, there's like the road to redemption within Strider's story. He will eventually become the king, or he just has this deep courage and altruism that drives him to be who he is.
Right.
And maybe that's something that the individual connects with, but can see more easily in the character.
Right, and it makes it seem like that interpretation of the shadow is one of potential, and there's like the golden shadow in there, right? It's Strider is a good example of like a shadowy being that becomes golden. Like he like rises into the light and he becomes king. He becomes king of the white city. So he goes from like dark black to like the king of the white. And there's like this transition there that like that's what integrating the shadow hopefully can be like, is that you take something that you've denied and you absorb it and it becomes something incredibly powerful within you. And it makes you wonder if this individual actually just has that sort of sense within himself.
Yeah.
The possibility of growth, the possibility of ascending. And that's his relationship with the shadow is actually one of being dynamic and changing, and there's power there. And that's very different than like, you know, the blob, which is like, you probably don't think of the blob as like, well, someday it'll be like king blob, like king of the blobs. Like the idea of like, there's like more of a dynamic arc there is like less prominent. And so it's interesting to see how people approach this in different ways.
But you know, like what comes to mind is that like the blob could be someone who was like, you know, a human person and they fell into like a vat of acid and like they turned into like blob monsters.
Origin story. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What is the origin story? Was it born a blob? Was it always like messed up and kind of mean? Or maybe it was like an innocent, open-hearted individual who, you know, an accident happened.
Maybe it was probably like a lawyer, and it's just like a gross, greedy lawyer who just like lives this like really like disgusting life, and like he has to pay for it by being turned into a blob, and like now he's like
cursed,
disgust embodied, and like he has to like redeem himself.
Okay, and I thought another interesting point. Sorry, I'm just like
just moving on.
My origin story was better.
Yeah.
Okay. Another interesting point someone brought up was that when they were put into the first breakout room, which is supposed to be like introduce your character and who are they and whatever details you want to give, this individual felt like they connected with these two strangers in a really dynamic and interesting way through the characters in a way that would not have happened if they weren't doing the exercise.
Right. So there were breakout rooms of 3. Right. So after people had come up with a character, we sent them into breakout rooms of 3 where there's just going to be a sharing of your experience, a sharing of your character and why you chose it, perhaps. That goes on for 15 minutes. And so that's what you're talking about, just to provide context.
Yes. So the question to me that sort of formulates in my mind is, why might we find it easier to relate to one another through these characters? What does that unlock?
Right. So in these breakout rooms, these 3 people, well, at least this person who shared, is explaining that they found that it was very, very easy to jump into a good conversation and connect with these people and kind of get to some of the more core attributes, core struggles, a lot of the barriers, you know, that might be in the way when you are just sort of meeting strangers at first.
Yeah.
Those things are just immediately washed away by this exercise of what is your mythological character, or what is your mythological shadow.
Right.
And that's interesting because it is something that seems simple, and yet it's not anything that you would ever really do like with strangers. Like, oh, like, hey, we just met, like, why don't we discuss like our D&D characters? It's like, you know, that wouldn't happen. And yet, like, there's something very interesting about like the ability to wash away those barriers immediately and kind of get into like kid mode. It's like, well, how do kids interact? It's like sometimes kids will just like start playing tag abruptly and they don't even know each other.
Yeah.
And it's like, they'll just do that because they're not very self-conscious about having to do these formalities and kind of play it safe with people, perhaps, or just this idea of like etiquette and what's appropriate. And those instincts are necessary for people to, you know, function in society, of course. Yeah. But it is interesting how leaping into a mythological framework about yourself can immediately take you to a place that is not only fun and curious and open and playful, but it's also very revealing. Yeah. And you can kind of get to know someone in this very interesting way that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, it certainly disarms a lot of the initial uncertainty that people have being thrown into, you know, a virtual room with strangers. And I think that's what's been interesting to witness across all different events at the Stoa. Like even when we're not talking about mythological shadow characters, there's often some way to break the ice, to kind of lean or anchor into a certain prompt that really helps people connect to each other in ways that, like, if you just like walked into a party, it just probably wouldn't happen very naturally.
Right.
But this specific exercise, I think, does help an individual feel comfortable with this part of themselves because they've kind of taken it out of their being and kind of placed it. There's like a little avatar they have in their mind, and it's they're introducing them, the other participants, to that that mythological shadow character, and through that story, you get to narratively discuss your own personal content, which can be hard to do, but it's like, let me tell you the story of it, immediately disarms it. And people get to understand it in a way, it's like they don't need the details. All of the personal elements get to sort of just fall to the wayside. And that's what I think is interesting about coming back to the archetypal ground of our shadow, is that at that core there's something that all of us can relate to. Like when you tell me about Strider or you tell me about the Blob, it's like, I don't need to hear all the personal details. That might be difficult for you. What's going to make you incredibly emotional, that might constellate some of that painful experience. Instead, you can tell me the story, the mythical story, and I can understand you and I get it. And then there's like a connection, a honest connection that happens.
Right. And this ties into all kinds of different concepts we've covered, but like metaphor,
Yeah.
just this thing metaphor is sort of like this more efficient way of conveying lots of information than trying to rationally explain something.
Yeah.
So like the tarot card, for instance, it's like you have a card, you can play it or you can put it down, let's say, and there's so much meaning conveyed in the image, and it conveys something that is so much more quick and direct and deep than actually rational explaining. Well, I'm at a weird crossroads in my life, and I just broke up with my boyfriend, and I have a new job now, and I got a dog, and you can go through this, and you can definitely explain your experience to someone, but it might be more efficient and more deep to just say, Six of Swords. If the person is familiar with that.
Sure.
And it's like, I see you're kind of like in the boat on the river and you're traveling to a new place, and like, there's like the tension in the water and the waves are crashing against you. And that's how you feel about your life right now. It's like this metaphorical story. And the same thing can be true for like this self-mythologizing, just taking yourself and putting yourself into a character. It's like, it's a metaphor. It's not literal. But it conveys all this information. It conveys all this meaning in a very efficient way of like, like I see who you are just by this little exercise in a way that it would have taken hours for you to really convey to me. And that also taps into creativity, because you're being creative by creating a character. And the opportunity to express yourself creatively also conveys all this strange, mysterious information about who you are as an individual. If you were going to paint something, it's like, whoa, that like your painting reveals so much about you that you couldn't really show me by talking to me for a long time. Or maybe you wouldn't even want to. Maybe you would hide it all. And that's what's powerful about this act.
So we're tapping into, I think, the ways that like the deep psyche really works, outside of the intellectual side, that like more left brain, you might say, or the rider and not the elephant. Like we're getting into like that deep part, the underneath the water, the full part of the iceberg. And to me, those sit on pillars of symbol and metaphor and narrative. Like we see that so prominently in our dreams, that unconscious expression seems to kind of bubble up into our conscious awareness through a dramatic structure, through story, or that when you look at the dynamics that are playing out in everyday life, in politics, and in the news, in your personal groups, it's like, what story is everybody tied to? I mean, we got into this with like personal myth, or even the religious function episode that we talked about. There's this deep way of relating to the world where we follow these stories, and at times we're so unaware of what those narratives are, that they're leading us into a place very unconsciously, like we're in a narrative of suffering or
Yeah.
a narrative of lack or something like that.
Yeah.
And so tapping into what those narratives are and really coming to understand them helps you shift them just to be more in alignment with them, to correct them if they need that. And we see that playing out in dreams, that they move through this dramatic structure. Like there's a story being told. And what is that story? What's this little snapshot that you see each night, and what's the commentary on your life within that dream?
Right. It's all kind of connected, right? I mean, what happens in your dreams, what you might come up with during active imagination, like we talked about last week. What you come up with if you're role playing,
Yeah.
or if you're playing a game, or you're improvising some character, or dramatizing some character in a play. There's all this creative energy that is the unconscious speaking in some way, and it's all connected. So like this game that we had people play at this event is something you could analyze, not exactly the same as a dream, but you could employ the same sort of ideas, which is like the images that appear in your dream are the unconscious trying to say something about who you are, or where you're at, or what you need, or whatever. And the character you create for yourself can be analyzed similar. The unconscious is speaking in some way. And you begin to see how all these things are connected in a way that can be really interesting, and you can play with it in all these different ways that can be like very profound.
Yeah, I think last week sort of helped lay some of that groundwork with your. Did you mention that you called it self-mythologizing?
Self-mythologizing.
I think you did.
That's the term I like now, at least.
But there you sort of explain to the audience that you have this host of characters, the like inner council of your spirit and your mind, and you interact with all of those parts. And some of them are maybe more conscious identifications. You're like, yeah, that's kind of me in like the everyday world.
Yeah.
Or there's a much more wounded part of you. There's ones that you might say is like, the trickstery shadow within and all of that. And taking that, building that host of characters, and then moving that into that more active imagination style exercise allows you to work with them on a somewhat regular basis, creating deeper understanding of like where you're at, or being able to explore some situation or issues that you're going through. And that's how this can be taken and applied to the shadow work process to just deepen your own self-development.
Right. There's all kinds of ways you can play with this, and there's all kinds of ways that you could develop this into a practice, an ongoing practice that evolves over time, and you might find things that work for you and other things that don't so much. But part of the event, the way we had it, is we wanted people to kind of think about these characters as something that they could hold on to and change. Maybe you chose Strider and you're like, you know what, that's not actually as good as like a different kind of Strider who's like maybe not going to be king, but instead like has this great burden that he has to carry for the rest of his life. Like maybe Strider has the reign and he has to carry the reign, and that's more of my shadow. It's like something you can play with that can evolve. And like last week's episode, so you can have a cast of characters and you can write stories with those characters, and you can have them play with each other. You can have those characters be the protagonist for one exercise, or they can be the antagonist for one exercise. It depends on what's calling to you. But it was interesting to see how people seem to interpret that. People had all kinds of like interesting ideas for what they might do with these characters.
Right.
And like one idea that was brought up was like a Zoom session in which the entire group tells a story together. It's like I'm not really sure how well that would work, but it's still like it's an interesting idea on Zoom. It's like, okay, so if everyone personified the shadow and we all were going to tell a story, I don't know how that would work with like 30 people, but yeah, I feel like you could certainly do it with like 5 people maybe.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's essentially what Dungeons and Dragons kind of is. But there's something that can be very revealing with that. And also the interacting with your shadow with other people is something that's powerful, because people can point out things to you.
Oh, that's right.
That you wouldn't, recognize in yourself otherwise. Yes. And that's part of the shadow. It's like, there's a reason you're not in touch with it. It's like, there's a reason you can't speak with it. There's a reason you don't see it. Yeah. Because that's the nature of the shadow. And so when it comes out, when you embody it in this character, for instance, you're externalizing it in some way that other people around you can say, oh, is this what your shadow is? Is this a weakness? Is this a strength? Is this something you're ignoring? And that's what someone said at the event, right?
Yes, that was like that. Aha, that's right. Because that was, I think, one of my favorite comments, and I totally forgot about it till this moment, was that someone was explaining their shadow character and maybe some of the second prompts that went a little bit deeper. And someone in their group made a comment about it, and it gave them a realization about this shadow dynamic, the shadow content that the individual had not realized. And they were someone who was not new to shadow work. That part that they were working with was something that they've been developing. And even then, a complete stranger could see something, have a little bit of a different insight that could totally shift the way that you're looking at it. And I was just so like overwhelmed with like happiness and like, yes, like that's why we're doing this. And that is why we have to be courageous and vulnerable enough to step into relationship with other people, because we cannot do this work alone.
Right.
And we're not meant to do it alone.
Right.
You know, relationships are the container of which we can project out our inner material, you know, and the relationships have to be strong enough to hold those projections. You know, we need to do an episode on projection and kind of really get into that. But
Totally.
like the point being, you know, we can't fully understand all of these parts of ourselves. We need to be able to externalize. We need to get that feedback. We need the mirror put up in front of us from others. And it sometimes is so overwhelming to hear those other perspectives. We want to deny them. You know, we want to tell people that that's not true, because when we're served back some shadow material, it's like, oh my God, like, no, thank you. That's not me.
Oh yeah. Totally. That's the way it is. You don't want to do shadow work by definition. It's like you do, but you don't.
It just brings up, I'm sorry, I'm like laughing because like I feel like shadow work is very popular right now.
It's a hot word.
It's a hot word.
Yeah.
A lot of people are talking about it, and I mean,
we're capitalizing on it for sure.
Yeah, it's true. But I don't often see a lot of people talking about how shitty it is. Like they'll say like, this is hard, but like how many people really try and are just like, no, thank you, man. It's been hard. It's been hard for me. It's not easy.
Well, that's how you know they're being honest, honestly. If you're just like, oh man, like I don't want to do this, or like I don't have the energy for this, or
it's tiring.
After our last session a week ago, someone did comment that like a lot of heavy things came up and they were not sure what to do with it. And it kind of like kept them distracted for the entire rest of the night until they eventually like had to distract themselves with something. And to me, it was like, well, good. It's like, it's good that happened. It's good that actually means it's working. It's not so good for you to not be able to do anything with it, or feel the need to like distract yourself. But it's not something that should be easy. And that's, the whole, it's funny because we can talk about spiritual bypassing, and then but even that's like a hot word where people are just like, oh, but that's just spiritual bypassing. And it almost makes you think like you need to like spiritually bypass spiritual bypassing now, because it's like, once you start naming things, people start adopting it as if it's something that they understand and they've mastered. And like shadow work is something that, people will talk about it, but I think it's probably pretty rare that someone is actually taking it very seriously, because it's really hard. It is very hard. And, not that like we're claiming to be experts or that we're doing it perfectly. This is why this is shadow play.
Yeah,
right?
certainly.
So we're calling it that. It's just like, we're just playing around. Like,
yeah, I think everyone does really need to find their own path down this, because there are times when you really, really do need to take it easy, and maybe you need to bypass a little bit, like you have to understand where your limitations are. And if you go full on in, you might touch things inside of yourself that you're just not ready to. And that's what I think is so interesting about doing deep inner work, is it always feels like this process of unfolding. And I feel like I've been working on a certain issue for like 5 years, but it's really different than it was 5 years ago. And that idea that like, when am I going to be done with this thing inside of myself? It's like, probably never. But at the same time, like, go easy on yourself and allow yourself to take breaks. Even in our event, we say, if you get overwhelmed, if this feels too intense, leave the Zoom room, like take a break, come into the main room with us. You know, it's not about pushing yourself too far. You know, it is about easing into this process, taking it seriously, but at the same time, taking your own health and well-being seriously too.
Yeah. I mean, something that I think a good rule of thumb for doing self-work is like, you have to acknowledge that the work you're doing now might not pay off for a year.
Yeah.
And if you're still okay with doing it, if you're still like, okay, I'll move forward anyways, even though this therapy I'm undergoing, it's painful and it's difficult, and I'm not going to see the benefits from it maybe for a year,
or years,
or longer,
years to come.
You know, you have to accept that, because that is how it works. It's like, it's a process, it's a practice that needs to be acknowledged, accepted. You can't come to one of our events, for instance, and it's like, shadow work managed. You know, I've said that term before. That's from Harry Potter, kind of. But the idea that you just like, oh, okay, I've got it figured it out.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you don't, and you haven't. And if you're saying that to yourself, then, you know, that's a red flag that you should be watching. Which is why, again, it's important to have other people to keep you accountable.
Yeah.
To tell you like, you have not like resolved your shadow. Like, sorry.
Or I did my 6 months of therapy. Like, I'm done now.
Right. Like, I've graduated and I'm like totally cured and I won't have any problems ever again.
Yeah.
So if I ever have any relationship conflicts again, it's the other person, because I'm fixed.
Yeah.
They need therapy.
Right.
Because I already went to therapy. And it's like, that kind of stuff is not, it's not a good way to think, because it's a never ending process.
Yes. The path of individuation never ends. You never truly get to the top of the mountain, you know?
Yeah.
The ascension should keep going every year until you die. Why would you want to stop, you know? I don't think there's some goal, right? Like, what is the summit? What's driving you? You want to get there. There's something that's really pushing you to evolve and to go deep within yourself and to connect authentically. But, you know, life is always shifting and changing, and those new dynamics are going to bring new insights or new ways that you have to adapt. And so to feel like this work needs to end, I think is just maybe either like a low resolution understanding of what it really is, or maybe that's coming from fear. But that's an opportunity for you to sit with that and kind of come into relationship with what that fear, anxiety really means for you, and why that seems to be the driving energy.
Yeah. So we're going to keep on doing events. Maybe not at the Stoa always, but Alyssa and I will probably be running a lot of events in the future, or at least we'd like to. We're thinking about it. So if you are listening and you have any interest in what kind of events we might be cooking up on Zoom, essentially this is going to be over the internet, of course, you can email us at goldenshadowpodcast@gmail.com. And we might not have anything to respond with right now because we haven't really thought about it, but
we're brainstorming a lot, and just the ground of experimentation that the Stoa has been so far these last couple of weeks have been really fruitful and interesting, and we certainly feel like it's a valuable practice that's being cultivated across lots of individuals.
A lot of potential.
This episode's coming out this weekend, Sunday, the 23rd or 22nd. So if you hear this in time and you want to come check out Shadow Play, we'll be doing our last session at the Stoa
on
Friday, the 27th. So www.thestoa.ca.
Yeah, just before we close it out, Alyssa, what is your shadow character?
Okay. My shadow character, one of them that I tapped into for this exercise, is the Dark Phoenix. So if you're familiar with X-Men, that is
Sophie Turner.
Sophie.
She's even more shadowy, right? Because she's a bad actress.
Yeah. No, Sophie was great in Game of Thrones, but I don't like her.
I don't want to hate on her too much, but I didn't
all
like her
of
as
these
Jean
new
Grey.
X-Men movies have not been good. But anyways, we're not going to talk about the actual. We're going to get into a tangent. Anyways, okay, the Dark Phoenix is an entity, actually, like this powerful universal force that takes over Jean Grey.
Cosmic, right?
Cosmic force that is basically so powerful and so overwhelming that it becomes this destructive energy, and she can't contain it inside of herself, and yet she somehow has like the power or the capability to hold all of that, like, you know, universal primordial chaos and creation dynamic inside of her. And I tapped into this for myself because I was asked recently about what's my relationship to anger. And I was thinking about how I think I deny that a lot in myself, and how when I feel intensely, you know, anger is not really the emotion that I deal with, but that ultimately there is a feeling inside of myself that I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And so I push it down and I create a barrier. And then when it does burst forth, it is incredibly destructive in me. Like, I don't throw stuff around or like curse people out, but I want to destroy like everything in my life. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
And that's that like inferior relationship of that anger in me, is that because I don't have a good dynamic with it, because I'm not well versed, when it bursts into consciousness, it just overtakes me. So the Dark Phoenix, the destructive energy within.
Right. So you're really powerful, and you have all these amazing abilities and knowledge, and you're so fluent in yourself in all these ways. And so that power, as I perceive that in you as well, like Alyssa can do very powerful things, and she's a very powerful person. And if you spend time with her, it's just like, whoa, how does she do it? So there's that kind of like sorceress thing, you know, that I think you identify with, like, you know, as far as like Dungeons and Dragons might go, or video games. But yeah, there is a pattern I see in you, certainly, of getting pushed into a weird place where suddenly you become like really destructive and really angry, and a lot of it is just like self-destruction or the pattern of purging almost, where it's like if something isn't right, it's like, well, just destroy it. Like, just hit the self-destruct button, or hit the destruct button on the thing that doesn't work. Like, just purge. And that usually, you know, it's not a healthy pattern.
No,
but
definitely not. That's a big
have
part
a
of my
huge amount of self-awareness about it. You've been aware of this for a very, very, very long time. You've been working on it for a long time. But yeah, that's just a cool example of, I guess I should probably do mine too, but mine's not as interesting though. I mean, the one I did at the event yesterday was just the little boy in the cave, which is, you know, it's kind of a different interpretation of the shadow, and everyone's interpretation is going to be different. But a huge part of my repressed, denied, unacknowledged energy is that of weakness and vulnerability. And there did come a time, I've probably talked about this on the podcast before, but there did come a time in my life where I felt as if I really, really needed to become strong. And I had to push very hard to become strong and kind of ascend into someone who was powerful almost artificially. And the only way that I felt like I could do that, not as if this was a rational decision, this is just happening completely unconsciously, but the only way I could do that was to sort of suppress like the little boy in me. And so there's a sensitive, more feeling, more emotional, more loving, vulnerable side of me that feels as if it's hiding and like cannot come out.
He was banished.
And he's sort of, I have this image of him sort of cowering in a cave, and he's crying, and he's too afraid to come out, and he's sort of waiting for a different side of me essentially to come and rescue him and pick him up and carry him out of the cave and tell him it's going to be all right. And that's the embodiment of my shadow.
Yeah. And, you know, a final note here is you're going to have many characters in your shadow. So you might have, you know, a wounded inner child, or you might have some critical part of yourself. There might be a powerful warrior wanting to emerge, and you can, you know, don't rush that process. If you go through these exercises of trying to find that that archetypal character, start with who comes up, and then, you know, they're in the arsenal now of the team that you're building. But maybe after a little while, you want to go find another individual in the shadow, another character, and you might have a few of them. You should, right? Because there's all these different dynamics that are being held within the shadow itself. So, you know, Arran's got, you know, the banished little boy, but there's some others that are in there too.
Yeah, like the god Arran, who is all powerful, all knowing, and that's an aim. You might say that's sort of like an instinctual aim of like, go more in that direction.
Yeah.
But I'm never going to become a god. She slipped in a little quiet no under her breath. You will never become a god. Okay. Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.